Welcome, everyone, to the PFF Fantasy Podcast. I'm John Macri, and I'm joined once again by the great Nathan Jahnke. Nate, it's Super Bowl week. Chiefs-Eagles rematch from a couple years ago. Maybe not, everyone's favorite pick for a matchup, but should still be a good one. Who's your pick? Who are you going with here, Super Bowl, for the Super Bowl 50?
I think Philadelphia, just because they've been playing well. I don't feel like most people are rooting against Kansas City at this point. I was happy that I was able to figure out jerseys in a way that I could wear Kansas City one week and Philadelphia another week. So I had Travis Kelce while I was talking tight ends last week.
Yeah.
This week I have my Harold Carmichael, Eagles Hall of Fame receiver from the 70s. So got that old school jersey. So at least was able to spread out those two teams over the 2 weeks leading up to the Super Bowl.
Nice. Love it. Yeah. I mean, it seems like Kansas City have made themselves into the villain at this point. It's hard to kind of root for them unless you're obviously a Chiefs fan, but should still be fun. Either way, it'd be kind of cool to see a three-peat, but I at the same time, I'd probably prefer the Eagles to win as well. But
being from Green Bay and Green Bay having the 3 straight championships in the 60s, as well as the 3 straight from 1929 to 1931, it's kind of nice having the only team that has 3 straight champions, but let that be.
Yeah, it's that's always nice to have that option, but we'll see what happens, man. It's gonna be interesting. Shout out to the Chiefs, obviously, for even making it back to this many Super Bowls every single year. It's just kind of nuts, but we're not diving into the Super Bowl today. We got a lot of other Super Bowl content in the PFF podcast feeds to keep you fulfilled there, but we're talking early 2025 positional rankings for fantasy football as we have the past few weeks. We covered quarterbacks, running backs, and while I was in a coma last week, Nate, you covered the tight ends. So be sure to check those ones out if you haven't already. And now we are on to the final position group, the wide receivers, where we're going to cover, top 12, but also a little bit more because we covered kind of the top 6 in a previous episode, Nate. And so we'll get a lot of bonus names in here than our usual top 12. You've put an article together like you did with the other positions where you're covering the tiers and the rankings for the wide receivers on pff.com, free for people to check out if they'd like. So we'll just kind of get into some detail about our names that we're going to cover today. So let's get right into it here. Now, we actually covered, like I said, the first 6 players on this list when we went through your top 12 overall players for fantasy for early 2025 ranks. But maybe quick here just to recap and highlight how you've separated them in terms of tiers. Nate, tier 1 for you is made up of 2 players, the LSU boys, Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson.
Those two feel like they're in a different group from everyone else because of how consistent they've been these past couple seasons. Jamar Chase, even though his grade hasn't been quite as high as some of these other wide receivers, just playing with Joe Burrow, having that consistency, having an elite quarterback where the other elite quarterbacks do not have clear top receiving options. So that puts Chase kind of in a category of his own. But Justin Jefferson has been grading well over these past several years. If anything, this past year was the worst one of his career, and he was still among the top couple fantasy wide receivers this season. And if anything, hopefully his quarterback situation gets even better next year, because either it'll be another year with Sam Darnold or they'll turn to the rookies. So I expect continued great things out of Jefferson. So these two are separate because I very much trust them to be among the top 3 or 4 fantasy wide receivers, where the others in tier 2, they have a decent enough chance to be the top overall fantasy wide receiver. There's just also a little bit more risk involved.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it just feels like between these two guys, like you can't really go wrong between the two. It's obviously hard for Chase not to be number 1 after what he did last year, and then obviously, like you said, having Joe Burrow at quarterback, there's no question mark there. Where like there might be with Minnesota. We'll see what happens with Darnold in free agency, and then if it isn't Darnold, we don't really know what JJ McCarthy is going to look like in the NFL either. So there's at least some question mark there, but Justin Jefferson, about as quarterback proof of a wide receiver as they come. So should be fine either way. All right, then in tier 2, we double up the names included in this tier, and it gives us the other 4 that we covered in that first round from before. CeeDee Lamb, Nico Collins, Puka Nacua, and Amon-Ra St. Brown for you, Nate.
Oh yeah, Lamb and St. Brown kind of fit in one category of the wide receivers who have been around for a couple years now, have consistently been fantasy starters. Lamb, I know, had a little bit of a down year this year, but when Dak Prescott was his quarterback, he was just fine. And he was coming off the season before where he was a clear top fantasy wide receiver. So trust him to have a little bit of a bounce back year, still only 25 years old, and should expect better things out of the Cowboys offense next year, where St. Brown, he's just consistently year in and year out a top 5 receiver, probably the worst odds out of these top 6 to make the top overall spot, just because he's in this Lions offense that they run the ball a lot. They have other receiving options, but in terms of his quality of play, it's consistently been excellent. He's consistently put up great numbers, even if it's not the top overall numbers. And then the other two receivers in the tier, Nico Collins and Puka Nacua, they've been two of the highest graded wide receivers recently. They have just both missed some time due to injury. Both have some little bit uncertain situations. With the Rams, Matthew Stafford's getting up there in age, so that's a little bit of a concern. And then with Nico Collins changing the offensive coordinator, with both of these wide receivers, a little bit unclear who the other wide receivers in the offense will be. With the Texans, Stephon Diggs is a free agent. Tank Dell maybe not won't play at all next season. With the Rams, there was the news a couple of days ago that they will be trading Cooper Kupp, so we don't know who the number 2 or the number 3 wide receivers for the Rams will be this upcoming season.
Yeah, that's going to be really interesting. Yeah, they got a lot of free agents as well, or at least I know Demarcus Robinson is also a pending free agent for the Rams. He played a big role for them. Yep, Tutu Atwell. So yeah, there's some key guys that played pretty heavy roles when guys like Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp were out. So it'll be interesting to see kind of how they fill that void if they are able to trade Cooper Kupp. It sounds like it's the most likely scenario. So it would be an interesting situation to follow. But yeah, Puka Nacua, just a target monster, regardless of who's in that offense. It seems like it was like a 37% target rate or something like that this year, which is just insane and way above anybody else at the position. So yeah, it'll be another great year for Puka, I'm sure, as long as he can stay healthy. So those are kind of the 6 names that we had talked about previously. We won't spend obviously a ton of time on them since we did talk about them in just a few episodes ago. But we'll get into some more detail in the players 7 through 18. I think it is are the other 12. So we'll get into them here in just a second. But first, I want to give a shout out to our friends at Fabric by Gerber Life. The new year is a great time to reevaluate financial goals, not just for yourself, but for your kids. Now is the perfect time to make sure your kids are on a path toward a solid financial future. A kid's investment account from Fabric by Gerber Life is quick and simple to set up and lets you invest in their future now for education, big milestones, and more. Fabric by Gerber Life was designed by parents for parents to make it easy to plan for and manage your family's financial path. With a kid's investment account from Fabric, you can start investing in your child's future today. Kids can't invest when they're minors, but a kid's investment account allows you to invest on their behalf now, giving their investments more time to grow. It's all online, and setting up an account can take you just 5 minutes. Then you can manage your child's account and monitor their investments right from your phone. Funds can be used for nearly anything benefiting your child, from tuition and tutors to music classes. And when they're adults and out on their own, they can use the funds for anything they need. Join the thousands of parents who trust Fabric to help protect their family. Start investing in your child today at meetfabric.com/fantasy. That's meetfabric.com/fantasy. meetfabric.com/fantasy. Portfolios managed by Fort Washington Investment Advisors, Inc. Additional services provided by Apex Clearing Corporation. All investing is subject to risk. Learn more at meetfabric.com. All right, let's get into more detail now, covering some of the names that we didn't cover last month in that first round, and start breaking down this 3rd and 4th tiers worth of players for you, Nate, which kicks off with a wide receiver we'll see this weekend in the Super Bowl. A.J. Brown of the Philadelphia Eagles is your wide receiver 7.
Yeah, Brown is probably the safest wide receiver that we'll be talking about today in these 2 tiers. His PFF grade over these past 2 years, it's been the 2nd highest among all wide receivers, so he's been excellent that way. 2.69 yards per route run this season when you include the playoff games, and that's his best among his 3 seasons with the Eagles. Had another great season with the Titans in terms of yards per route run in there, but Brown, just in terms of quality of play, has been excellent. The only problems is his routes per game have dropped pretty substantially this past year. Was 34 in both 2022 and 2023. That dropped to 28 in 2024. Saquon Barkley probably having a very large role in that. routes dropping as well as just the Eagles winning games, Brown not being needed in the games late in the fourth quarter. He's also just disappeared in some games where the Eagles haven't needed him as much. We saw that in the playoffs, these first two rounds of the playoffs, where he barely had any receptions or receiving yards, but then caught six passes, 96 yards, and a touchdown this past week. So a lot of his problems, I don't think, are so much Brown not playing well. It's just the Eagles playing too well that they don't need Brown to play well some weeks. But also worth noting, they will probably lose offensive coordinator Kellen Moore. It sounds like he is the favorite to land the Saints head coaching job after the Super Bowl. So a new offensive coordinator sounds likely in Philadelphia. I don't think that'll have a huge impact on Brown unless it's someone who is very much run heavy, more so than what we've seen in the past in Philadelphia. But it's hard to think that any offensive coordinator would take Brown more out of the offense, considering just how good of a wide receiver he is.
Yeah, there's no doubt he's an amazing wide receiver, but I'm with you. I think it makes sense to kind of have him outside of that previous top six that we talked about, but still like high enough here, wide receiver 7. Because yeah, like you said, I mean the receiving grades have been excellent this past year. 91.6 receiving grade in the regular season. That was the best mark of his 6-year career. Obviously missed a chunk of games at the start of the year as well, and just on top of like the Eagles being like that run first offense, like you said, there's also some kind of high end target competition there in Devontae Smith and to an extent Dallas Goedert at times as well, but mostly Devontae Smith. I think week 15 was the only week all season where both guys were able to put up a top 20 finish each for that week. And actually it was much better than that. Both of them finished in the top 12 for that week, but that was the only time all year where every other game, if one of them finished inside the top 15, the other did not. And it wasn't usually particularly close. So it's kind of difficult to have like high hopes for both guys across an entire season. It feels like in this type of offense, but it's not impossible either. They just need to be maybe a little bit more pass heavy like they were in that week 15 game, but it's just not very common for them, like you said. So yeah, well, the offensive coordinator change could also change that as well. All right, next up, staying in the NFC East, coming off a great rookie season in 2024, it's Malik Nabers of the New York Giants at wide receiver 8 for you, Nate. This is really where we start to see some of the newer, younger names that weren't inside the top 12 last year. So, what's got Nabers leading the new youth movement for you heading into 2025?
Was very consistent as a rookie, top 10 in receiving grade, top 10 in receiving yards, had at least 41 receiving yards in every single game in his rookie season. Ended up with 7 straight games with 60 or more yards to close out the season. We'll have the same coaching staff, so that should be a positive because that coaching staff was so heavy in getting Nabers the ball. Ideally, we'll have a much better quarterback. It'll be interesting to see what they end up doing at the quarterback situation. Could add a rookie or a veteran to the group, but hopefully, whoever it is, it'll be better than what it was this past year. So I think because of the better quarterback situation, people are expecting Nabers to even potentially end up as a first round fantasy pick. For me, my concern of not putting him quite there yet is what else the Giants will do with their offense this season. They have plenty of cap space, and Nabers had the second highest targets per route this past season, 29.7%. So that could very well decrease if the Giants make some upgrades at offense. Darius Slayton's a free agent, so I would expect him to land somewhere else, and for the Giants to have a different wide receiver as the wide receiver 2. Also, Tyrone Tracy, Theo Johnson, both rookies. I don't think either of them played quite well enough to prevent the Giants from adding another player at those positions. So I wouldn't be surprised if there are upgrades at multiple skill player positions that leads Nabers to not need to have quite as high of a target share. So his numbers might not be quite as good this year, but hopefully having a better quarterback will help offset that.
Yeah, like you said, there's a lot that probably has to change with this Giants offense if they want to have success because it was just so much of it relied on Neighbors, like you said, like the clear number one target for the Giants. I mean, he was if it wasn't for Puka Nakua, he was arguably the top target in the league on a per route basis. Like you said, 29.7% target rate is second highest mark behind that ridiculous 37 that Puka Nakua put. But Yeah, Neighbors was kind of the entire Giants offense in a way, and it wasn't a great offense to begin with, so there was only kind of so much that he could do with his opportunities too, so I could understand the optimism for an improvement here in year 2, but yes, one of the things that I wrote about last week was like catchable target rate for wide receivers, and Neighbors was somebody that kind of stood out. Just a 74% catchable target rate that ranked 56th percentile, so right around average. But obviously, that's a number that could positively regress for him next year, depending on who comes in at quarterback. But he's kind of proven, even with average quarterback play, if not bad quarterback play at times, he was still able to finish as the wide receiver 6 on the year. So yeah, future is bright for Malik Neighbors heading into 2025. And just like I said, like you said, just going to be really curious to see how this offense changes as the offseason progresses. Okay, continuing with players coming off great rookie seasons with a lot of optimism behind them heading into year 2. How can we not talk about Brian Thomas Jr. of the Jacksonville Jaguars, who truly emerged as a high end fantasy asset, especially in the latter half of the year? BTJ is wide receiver 9 for you after finishing his rookie season as a top 5 fantasy wide receiver. Can he stay hot in year 2, Nate?
I think so. I think these a couple of wide receivers, it'll be pretty fluid where they end up in the rankings depending on what happens in free agency and the draft. And I think Brian Thomas fits a little bit in that category. First off, a little bit concerned that he averaged 14.4 fantasy points per game with Trevor Lawrence, and then that increased to 19.3 with Mac Jones. Hopefully, that's just Thomas getting better as his rookie season progresses and not a quarterback split kind of thing. Because if it is, that could be a problem with Trevor Lawrence at quarterback. But I think the really interesting thing with Thomas in general is now he has Liam Cohen as his head coach, also offensive play caller, and what that'll mean for how Thomas is used this year. We saw Chris Godwin average 19.7 fantasy points per game over the first 7 weeks this past year, and then he had his injury. Mike Evans was only at 13.6 fantasy points per game during that stretch of time, and then over the second half of the season when Godwin was injured, Evans was second in fantasy points per game. But even going back a couple years when Cohen was the offensive coordinator for the Rams, we saw Cooper Kupp lead the league in fantasy points per game, playing out of the slot. So even though it's certainly possible for an outside receiver to do really well in this offense because we just saw it happen with Mike Evans, it would probably be even better if Thomas ends up as the slot receiver out of Jacksonville because we saw both Godwin and Kupp have pretty elite fantasy production in that role in this offense. So I'll be interested to see where Thomas ends up lining up in the offense. He only ran 147 routes from the slot, which was 28% of his routes, but he graded much better from the slot than out wide. 3.12 yards per route run from the slot. 7 of his 10 touchdowns came while lined up in the slot. So Thomas has shown that he can do really well in that position. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with the other Jaguars receivers this offseason. They're kind of stuck with Gabe Davis's contract for another year, so he'll be one of the outside receivers. But then Christian Kirk, if he is back on the team, if he's healthy and on the roster, then he might end up being that slot receiver who does really well. But the Jaguars could also move on from Kirk, save a bit of money against the salary cap, in which case Thomas could end up there, but then who ends up being the third receiver out of Jacksonville. So I think a couple of things could happen, but I think if there's a pretty clear sign that Thomas is the slot receiver in Jacksonville, he could be moving up these rankings, maybe even moving up to another tier.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's hard. Like I could definitely see this kind of going like either way for Thomas in year 2, right? Like he didn't necessarily see that kind of elite target rate that Malik Neighbors was getting right off the bat in his rookie season, but in that final stretch of the season, he really kind of emerged as like the clear focal point of the offense. Now, some of that was because of injuries to the Jaguars' other receiving options, Christian Kirk, Evan Ingram, Gabe Davis, but he was also without his starting quarterback, Trevor Lawrence. So there was that change, like you mentioned, with Mac Jones in there, but he stepped up in a big way, right? Like he hadn't seen 10 or more targets in any of his first 11 games of the season. And then coming out of their week 12 bye, he finished the year from week 13 on with 6 straight of seeing at least 10 targets in every game. Finished as the wide receiver 2 from that point on as well, only behind Jamar Chase. Now, like you said, obviously next year is going to look pretty different, at least, with Trevor Lawrence at quarterback, new coaching staff, Christian Kirk, Evan Ingram, maybe get healthy. Maybe they even add someone to that wide receiver core. We'll see, but definitely kind of hard to argue that BTJ didn't really help, that he didn't help his case to be in consideration here among the top 12 wide receivers for 2025, and where you have him inside the top 10 as well. So yeah, loved what he put together in his rookie year, and hopefully he could keep it going in year two. Okay, how about a wide receiver who didn't have the rookie season coming out of 2023 that guys like Neighbors and BTJ had, but definitely broke out in year two? Jackson Smith-Njigba of the Seattle Seahawks as emerged as the wide receiver 1 for Seattle, and for fantasy as the PPR wide receiver 8 in 2024. So how are we feeling about JSN heading into 2025, Nate?
I'm feeling pretty good about him. He had that great stretch to end the season. 7th most fantasy points over the past 10 weeks, 8 straight games with at least 69 receiving yards. So had a very strong stretch in there. He has Clint Kubiak as his offensive coordinator now, which I think is both a mix of good news and bad news. We've seen Kubiak basically change teams each of the past couple seasons. And with Denver and San Francisco, he had more receiving yards to the slot receivers in the year that he was either offensive coordinator or pass game coordinator, or whatever his role was, compared to the year before and the year after. So he seems to like throwing to the slot receivers, which is good news for Smith-Njigba. The only concern is he has also been on offenses that have been a little bit more run heavy than pass heavy, especially these past 2 seasons, top 5 teams in terms of run rate in neutral situations. Part of that is having Alvin Kamara and Christian McCaffrey at running back, but Kenneth Walker has been one of our highest graded running backs, so Walker could have a big season with this offensive coordinator. And also teams that generally run either below average number of plays or average number of plays, so that could also hurt a little bit, but I think them throwing so much to the slot will help offset that. So I think Kubiak probably fits this offense pretty nicely with the talent that they already have on the roster.
Yeah, I hope so. Because there was definitely a part of me that was kind of bummed to see the team move on from Ryan Grubb after just 1 year, because it was kind of his offensive approach that made us a little bit more excited about JSN heading into last season. And then Seattle was a top 5 team in pass rate as well. But like you said, Clint Kubiak coming in here to be the new offensive coordinator. The pass rate thing was definitely lower with Kubiak on his other teams. It was with New Orleans. He was 17th in pass rate. When he was the offensive coordinator in Minnesota in 2021, he was 22nd in pass rate. It wasn't a full season of him as a play caller in Denver, I think in 2022, when he took over the play calling duties from Nathaniel Hackett. But when he did take over, they actually dropped in pass rate then as well. Now, it's not like that it's a death knell of any kind. We've seen great wide receivers overcome below average pass rates for their offenses before. I mean, Justin Jefferson in 2021 with Clint Kubiak in that Minnesota Vikings team didn't have a problem. Even if there wasn't really like another kind of prime beneficiary on the team, like there was Adam Thielen on that 2021 Vikings team. He had 10 touchdowns on like 67 targets. So that doesn't really count. The rest of his receiving production was not as high as it could have been. So JSN, like, he could still be very good, but we just might not get that nice kind of, I guess, volume cushion like you alluded to there that we had this year. And then DK Metcalf could always bounce back as well on top of that, right? So there's risk there with JSN, I guess is what I'm getting at. I definitely think he has the talent to finish top 10 again, but there's just more kind of going against him than what helped him get there in 2024 is all.
Yeah, and that's just compared to some of the other young elite wide receivers that we've been talking about. He's still graded very well, still very talented, and we expect him to be the focal point of the passing game. So a lot of good things going in his direction as well. Just good and bad when we're also talking about a number of other great players and why we have him where we have him.
Exactly. Okay, last name in tier 2 here, Nate. Rashee Rice of the Kansas City Chiefs has been great when he's on the field, but injuries kept him from appearing in all but 4 games in 2024. Now, heading into 2025, we are assuming he's healthy and ready to go, but there's also concern for that looming suspension this season, Nate, and that could change his ranking a lot if that comes down before the regular season kicks off.
Yeah, so he has averaged 18.1 PPR points per game in his last 13 full games. That includes the playoffs for Kansas City a year ago. That's all since he started playing at least 60% of offensive snaps consistently in the offense. So he has been among the best fantasy wide receivers when healthy, in terms of PFF receiving grade over the past 2 seasons, 12th best among wide receivers. So has graded very well when given the opportunities as well. When we're talking about a lot of the quarterback situations that we've gone through recently, Seattle, Jacksonville, New York, there's either unknown quarterbacks or Geno Smith, who we know is an average NFL quarterback, where Rashee Rice has one of the best quarterbacks in the league. And once we get to some of these other wide receivers on the list, some of them have some questionable quarterback situations as well. So the quarterback situation definitely helps Rice out here. For me, the concern is probably more so about recovering from the injury than it is the suspension. If he is suspended, say the first 4 or 6 games of the season, we hopefully will know that ahead of time, and that's just the beginning parts of the season. We know he'll be good to go for the fantasy playoffs. Where last season, when we were unsure of the suspension, part of the concern is maybe he gets suspended in week 10, and then all of a sudden we don't get him when we need him the most. Where I can be a little bit more okay missing a player the first couple weeks of the season. We saw plenty of players like Puka Nacua miss the beginning parts of the season and still help fantasy managers throughout the rest of the season. But the LCL tear, it's a little bit unusual. We've seen a couple wide receivers have this in recent years: Kenny Galladay, AJ Green, Mike Williams, Tyreek Hill. All of them either had other knee issues as well, or it was something that happened later in their careers. So I couldn't really find a great comparison for Rice and what the recovery might be like, since ideally, yes, he is fully ready to play week 1, but will he be 100% the player that he once was from the injury? We've seen plenty of other injuries where it takes some time. And even though this happened early in the season rather than later in the season, hopefully that helps a little bit, but there's still a chance that Rice still might not be the same guy. So I think there is a bit of a risk here, which is why Rice is below some of these other young wide receivers. But I think if everything goes right, there's a chance that Rice is the top wide receiver this year.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's a lot going on with Rashee Rice, just to kind of figure out this year. Well, I mean, we'll learn more as the offseason progresses, right? In terms of, what his health is, where he'll be at the start of the season, and what that suspension hopefully looks like as well would be pretty important. If it's 3 to 4 games or whatever, like you said, there's always the potential that it could be like an 8-gamer as well, right? So there's all kinds of question marks right now around Rashee Rice. So there's risk for sure, like you said. I know, last year when we had the question marks about suspensions, we didn't know if it was going to be start of the year or beginning of the year, and he was being drafted outside the top 30 wide receivers. But when he was on the field, he was unreal. Like you said, he was one of the top wide receivers in fantasy. So yeah, it's just figuring out what the suspension and how much time he's going to miss and all those kinds of things that's going to factor in here, whether he's going to be a top 12 pick or not. But I mean, it's definitely possible. If it's a short suspension and if he seems like he's healthy, then yeah, I'd be fine with it for sure. So yeah, it's just a lot of question marks still. Okay, let's go on to let's do one more ad break here from our people here at DraftKings Pick 6. Have you played Pick 6 from DraftKings yet? What are you waiting for? You better get on it. The playoffs are here and time is running out. As the official daily fantasy sports partner of the NFL, DraftKings does fantasy sports like no one else. Play for better payouts on Pick 6. It's super easy to get started. Select 2 or more players. Choose if they'll have more or less of a stat like touchdowns, yardage, sacks, and more. Pick 6 is available in most states, including Missouri, California, Texas, Georgia, and more. And DraftKings is making it even sweeter for first-timers. New Pick 6 customers play $5, get $50 in Pick 6 credits. Win more cash on Pick 6. Download the DraftKings Pick 6 app and use code PFF. That's code PFF for new customers to play $5, get $50 in Pick 6 credits. Only on DraftKings Pick 6. The crown is yours. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Help is available for problem gambling. Call 888-789-7777 or visit ccpg.org in Connecticut. Must be 18 plus. Age and eligibility restrictions vary by jurisdiction. Pick 6 not available everywhere, including New York and Ontario. Void where prohibited. 1 per new customer. Bonus awarded as non-withdrawable Pick 6 credits that expire in 30 days. Limited time offer. See terms at pick6.draftkings.com/promos. All right. Moving on to the final tier that we'll cover today, tier 4. And yeah, there are more players and more tiers in Nate's article on PFF.com, which again, you can check out for free right now. So leading off tier 4 for you, Nate, a player who is going to be one of the most discussed names of this early off season, as he's potentially going to hit the open market. T. Higgins is wide receiver 12 for you, Nate. So feeling pretty optimistic about him without a landing place in place yet.
Yeah, was fifth in fantasy points per game this past year, one of the top graded wide receivers, so was excellent from that perspective. Even going back a couple years, was a bit lower last year due to injuries, but in 2022 was 16th in fantasy points per game. So still as the number 2 wide receiver in Cincinnati, having a ton of fantasy production. I think if he lands back with the Bengals, which I think is still a possibility, I think this is right around the ballpark that I would have him in just after this great season. But ideally, the Bengals defense is playing a little bit better, so they don't need to throw quite as much as they did this year. So could see him being a little bit lower than this year if he returns to Cincinnati. I think if he lands with the Patriots, that's probably the best case scenario outside of Cincinnati. Just with Drake May at quarterback, I think May can have a clear top fantasy wide receiver who does very well. I think Higgins could have a very high target share in that offense, considering the other receiving options that they have. And I think May, in terms of his accuracy on deep and intermediate passes, was better than a lot of other quarterbacks. They just didn't have any of the receivers to really take advantage of that kind of accuracy. So I think Higgins would take advantage of it. I think Higgins, being the clear kind of higher average depth of target player in Cincinnati, has benefited a lot from having Joe Burrow at quarterback. So there's also plenty of scenarios where if he lands on a team with a not as great quarterback, there'd be a bit more concerns, would probably be dropping him down these rankings. Teams like the Titans, with their quarterback situation, or even landing on a team like Denver or Washington, where the quarterback situation isn't quite as good as having Joe Burrow, but also they have the competition for targets as well, like Higgins has had. So ideally, he lands on a team where he has a higher target rate while still having a pretty decent quarterback.
Yeah, I like that. As you were talking about, if he stays with the Bengals, does he move up or down or stay the same? It kind of got me thinking a little bit, and I was looking at like potential landing spots in free agency. So maybe let's do like a little quick just kind of recap of up and down landing spots. Okay, so some of the popular ones for T. Higgins. So the first one being the Cincinnati Bengals. Would you move him up, down, or stay the same as wide receiver 12?
I think leave him here if he stays with the Bengals.
Okay. How about the Los Angeles Chargers?
Chargers, I would probably move him down. We'll be talking about McConkey very shortly, but concerned about how much the Chargers could be running the ball as well as having that target competition with McConkey.
Nice. And then the New England Patriots, you said was one of your favorites. So assuming you'd move them up.
Yeah, I'd probably move him up a little bit at least above Rashee Rice, probably potentially above Smith and Jigba as well. But it'll be interesting to see what else the Patriots do at wide receiver. But I think up with the Patriots.
Nice. Tennessee Titans.
Titans down without knowing their quarterback situation, and it's hard for them to have a quarterback that would be good enough for me to be excited enough about Higgins to have him in the same spot.
Nice. How about going to Washington with Jaden Daniels and Terry McLaurin?
Washington, I would probably leave him right around the same spot. I think it'd be a pretty similar situation, maybe not quite as much volume in the passing game in general, but I think there is a high enough target share that he could carve out in Washington with a good enough quarterback play.
Nice. Okay, two more. Actually, there are already names that you mentioned, but Denver Broncos.
Denver, probably moving them down since I think they like to run the ball too much. And then they also have Cortland Sutton, who commands plenty of targets, and they have a lot of other young wide receivers that they'd get a couple of targets in here and there as well.
Okay. And Pittsburgh Steelers.
Pittsburgh, probably move them down because we don't know who the quarterback is going to be, especially if they stick with Justin Fields at quarterback, then I'd be a little bit concerned.
Okay, fair enough. All right, so we got, so that's 7 potential landing spots. We got 4 where he could move down, 2 where he could stay the same, and 1 where he would move up. So, yeah, not too bad. I mean, 4 to 3 basically for wide receiver 12 in that range. I mean, I love T. Higgins. I just want him to stay healthy, and I like the landing spot for the Chargers, but Yeah, we'll see what happens there. I mean, I think they need like a true wide receiver one. I love Lad McConkey as well. I think I don't really think he's hurt too much by somebody like Higgins coming in, but you're right that there is the potential that they could run the ball at a pretty high rate. But just having that Justin Herbert connection, I think would be nice for him.
Yeah. And in general, when we're talking about a top 12 player in general, there are more things that can happen that can move a player down the list than there are that can
Yeah,
move a player up the list, just
for
because
sure.
it's so hard to take those top spots.
Absolutely. All right. Okay. Next up is Drake London of the Atlanta Falcons, who we knew had that top 12 potential despite not even cracking like the top 24 fantasy wide receivers in his previous NFL seasons. But new coaching staff, upgrade at quarterback, helped London kind of take his game to the next level in 2024. Finished as the wide receiver 10. Again, I'm looking at wide receivers from weeks 1 to 17. He also had a massive week 18 in there, but I didn't include that in there, which is part of the Michael Penix era. So London delivered on his ADP from this past offseason where he was in that kind of wide receiver 10 range and solidified his spot, I think, among the top options now, seemingly going forward.
Oh, yeah. A lot of guys we've talked about today. There's a lot of things that could be changing in the offseason with London. I think the situation is going to be pretty stable. Same coaching staff, not expecting them to make too many changes to their skill players. The cap situation is not great for Atlanta, but if anything, I think that could mean changes to the offensive line or the defense. But London was 14th in points per game. He was healthy, relatively healthy throughout the season, so that helped him rack up some of these cumulative numbers among the top players in receiving yards this past year. Had a pretty high target rate of 26.9%, great at avoiding tackles. So someone who doesn't have the highest average depth of target and does a lot after the catch. I didn't feel like the quarterback situation changing was going to change too much, but it was worth noting in the 3 games with Penix, his target rate skyrocketed to 35.9%, 3.32 yards per route run in the 3 games with Penix. Matchups were also a little bit favorable there, so that could have played into things a little bit, but at least a chance that he sees even more targets with Penix at quarterback. I'm guessing ideally they spread the ball around a little bit more in Atlanta, but I think London has the talent to be the clear number 1 wide receiver in Atlanta, a situation where they're going to need to pass the ball plenty as well. So I think London, a very safe top 20 wide receiver. I'm just not sure there's going to be a lot of scenarios where he ends up as a top 5 fantasy wide receiver unless he steps his game up to an even higher level.
Yeah, it was a really nice season for him. I mean, as much as, you know, we talked about Kirk Cousins being an upgrade over London's previous quarterback situations coming into the year. Like Cousins, as we know, he wasn't so good that he propped London up probably more than he really should have. I mean, I think London really earned his production in 2024. He set a new career high in PFF receiving grade, 90.1. That ranked 4th among wide receivers. Set a new career high in yards per route run, 2.32. That ranked 11th. 27.2% target rate was a big improvement from 2023's target rate of 21.9%. But it was actually the exact same that he saw as a rookie when he finished as wide receiver 37. So, you know, improved quarterback play helped again, but it wasn't so amazing that he was like just a product of improved quarterback play either, because he only saw a 73% catchable target rate, which was 49th percentile among wide receivers, and basically right on what he saw in 2023. So I liked what London did quite a bit. I'm a believer in him. I think there's potentially some room to grow for him after finishing as wide receiver 10 this past year. We'll obviously see what Michael Penix looks like on an entire season, but yeah, I came away feeling pretty optimistic about Drake London after this past season. Okay, how about another excellent season from a rookie wide receiver, leading to a nice ranking here? Nate, Lad McConkey was the clear wide receiver 1 for the Chargers in 2024. That wasn't any more clear than it was in the playoffs when he put up like nearly 5 times as much receiving yards than anyone else on the team on 14 targets, when the rest of the team combined for 16 across 6 other players. So it's early in the offseason here. We talked a little bit about the Chargers already. They have to add someone to that wide receiver room, I think, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it'll be someone that takes that wide receiver 1 role away from McConkey either. So for now, he's wide receiver 14 for you, Nate.
Oh, yeah. And of the season with 11 straight games with at least 50 receiving yards, so it was very consistent down the stretch. Like you said, that excellent playoff game, 197 yards there, was 11th in fantasy points per game from week 8 on, so was a very good fantasy producer. My concern, like you said, is if they add players, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's more than just one player. They have the fifth most cap space out of any team, and it's not just the wide receiver position. They could upgrade at running back. They could upgrade at tight end as well. Josh Palmer is a free agent at wide receiver, so definitely going to do something at one of the wide receiver spots. Could very well add a second wide receiver too. So a bunch of different players who could command a little bit higher target share than the previous player at that position, which could all cut into McConkey's target rate. And particularly more so concerned about McConkey than some of the other teams that might add a wide receiver, because this coaching staff has such a long history of wanting to run the ball, going back to the 49ers and then the Ravens more recently. They just didn't have the running backs to and the offensive line to run the ball as much as they wanted this past year. I think if they're able to bring in the players that they want to bring in this offseason, especially with the second year with the team, being able to add more players, I wouldn't be surprised if this Chargers team becomes more run heavy than we saw this past year.
Yeah, that's a good point. And, thinking about McConkey, like, I think the nice thing about a wide receiver like him is that, like, even if the Chargers bring in another, couple wide receiver options this offseason, like, they might not be somebody that cancels out McConkey completely, given like his ability to kind of work out of the slot and in the middle of the field, right? He's kind of locked that role in where they really need those kind of like the X wide receiver, where maybe it is somebody like T Higgins, because they just don't have that right now. So I think McConkey, like, he'll still see a ton of targets in the middle of the field. It's just possible that we see another consistent option added in there as well, which, yeah, outside of a couple like Quentin Johnston moments where he overcame his stone hands, it just never really happened in 2024, and led to a lot more work funneled in McConkey's direction. So yeah, I'm with you. I think there's definitely potential that he's not as heavily involved as he was that latter half of the season, but we'll see. As of right now, it's still just the McConkey solo show until they make those changes. So hard not to be excited about it.
Yeah, and it's a situation where, like, if they don't make those changes over these next few months, then McConkey's probably moving up the rankings a couple spots.
Yeah, that's a good point. All right, Terry McLaurin is up next. He has long been one of the top values in ADP, almost always being drafted outside where his actual finish ends up being. But after the best year of his NFL career and finishing as wide receiver 7, those discount days may be over as he comes in as wide receiver 15 for you right now, Nate.
Yeah, which part of his fantasy finish this past year is he was able to stay healthy. That's part of the good news with McLaurin, is he's generally been healthy throughout his career, but was 16th in points per game. So expect him to be right around where he was. Considering the talent and the other receiving options in Washington, he had a surprisingly low targets per route run, only around 20.5%. So that was a little surprising to see. But the good news there is Washington has a ton of cap space, so they're probably going to upgrade their number 2, number 3 wide receiver positions. Could very well bring in back some of the players that they had, but Noah Brown, Diami Brown, Jamison Crowder, Zacchaeus, all free agents this season, so Washington is pretty open to do what they want at wide receiver. But even if they bring in someone like T. Higgins, McLaurin can very well still have 20.5 targets per route, because then someone else is just getting 20-something targets per route, and that perfectly fits into the offense. So I could see McLaurin having a very similar season, even if they upgrade at wide receiver. So he's just someone that I think is very safe to be a top 20 or so finisher, but probably not going to finish in the top 10. And I think that's partially why he's always been a value where he's being drafted, because he can always do a little bit better than where he's being drafted, but it's hard to see him being one of those top 10 fantasy receivers because he's never graded quite at that level and not getting targeted quite at that level.
Yeah, he's a fun one, because he's kind of like I think the perfect like 2024 example of how much a good or bad quarterback can make a difference in a player's fantasy production, because after years of kind of below average quarterback play and never cracking that top 12 fantasy wide receivers, Jane Daniels comes in and delivers by far like the best catchable target rate of his NFL career. It was 80% for Terry McLaurin catchable target rate this year. That gives him this great wide receiver 7 finish, thankfully, for that much better quarterback play, and allowed him to kind of thrive the way he's seemingly always meant to be. Now, something I talked about in that article that I mentioned, the catchable target rate one, is that covers fantasy points versus expected based on the catchable target rate, was that catchable target rate is so unstable, even with the same quarterback, that we could always see a regression from that 85th percentile mark that he was at this past year. But even with an average target rate from Jaden Daniels in 2024, it only would have dropped McLaurin to like wide receiver 10 instead of wide receiver 7 or something like that. So I'm fine with him here as kind of like wide receiver 15 when you bake in kind of, other potential regressions as well for McLaurin, but probably the most prominent regression point for him is going to be touchdowns. He had something ridiculous. I don't have the number in front of me. I feel like it was 16 touchdowns or something like that this year. Is that right? Or am I making that number up?
That
It was very
might
high.
include the playoffs at 13, I think, in the
13,
regular
of course.
season.
Right. Okay.
But also, he was like the king of contested target catches. He had by far the most contested targets, best contested rate of catching the ball that we have seen of anyone with any kind of decent sample size. So even though that's something that could regress, and we've seen at time, we've also seen McLaurin have other excellent seasons at contested catches. So even though that's something that's not always the most consistent, that is something McLaurin has been good at throughout his career.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and you're right. It was 13 touchdowns, which is a pretty high number. Obviously, the most he had in his career up until that point was 7, so nearly double his past career high. But I mean, Jaden Daniels being at quarterback and trusting him in those situations, like you said, deep downfield and in the red zone, has been a key for him and that fantasy success this year. So hopefully that continues as well. All right, next up is a wide receiver who's had that high ADP in back-to-back seasons, and while he wasn't able to deliver on it in 2023, he did so last year, finishing as the PPR wide receiver 9. Garrett Wilson of the New York Jets comes in as the wide receiver 16 for you, Nate. A lot of question marks probably around what that Jets offense will look like in 2025. So is that what kind of has Wilson at his, I guess, his lowest pre-draft ranking for you since his rookie season?
Yeah, there's that, and also just he hasn't graded out as well as we've expected in general. Third in targets this past year at 152, but over the past 2 seasons, 79.5 PFF receiving grade, which is only 36th best out of all the wide receivers with, I think, 300 routes. So that's the second lowest out of all the wide receivers we talked about so far. The only one lower was Jackson Smith-Njigba, but that's because of his poor rookie season, and then he's graded better, especially over the second half of this past year. So this past year, Smith-Njigba graded better than Wilson as a receiver. So a lot of things that could be happening if he stays with the Jets that will be a little bit concerning. They brought in Tanner Ingstred as their new offensive coordinator. History with the Detroit Lions, who have been a pretty run-heavy team. Anytime I can go back and look at our XFL or any of those other league data, I enjoy it. So going back to when he was the offensive coordinator of the DC Defenders of the XFL in 2020, was one of the most run-heavy teams in the XFL then. So I think a team that will run the ball more than we saw this past year. So that could impact things, but also there have been talks that if Aaron Rodgers stays with the Jets, which it sounds like might be happening, that Wilson might not want to stay with the Jets. So he could very well get traded. And then there's a whole bunch of scenarios of where he could get traded to or not get traded to, which could, again, increase or decrease his value. But someone who's still a relatively young receiver, someone who could have a much better season than what we've seen before. And he has put up decent numbers in general, but they just haven't been quite as good as a lot of the other wide receivers we've talked about.
Yeah, yeah, it'll be interesting. I mean, the trade rumors for Garrett Wilson, obviously, yeah, swirling since I guess it was the end of last year. It seems like none of the NFL's Garretts are happy with their current franchises. So we'll see what happens with Wilson and Miles this offseason. But I think, yeah, Wilson he'll have a chance to be a top fantasy asset depending on landing spot here. I'll just be curious to see if yeah, a team trades for him entering that fourth year of his rookie contract, which I'm sure he'll get a fifth year option as well. But he's been top 5 in total targets in the league in each of the past 2 years as well, right? So a lot of that production that he's put together has been volume based, and like you said, there maybe some of the underlying metrics haven't been as strong. So just something to kind of keep an eye on with Garrett Wilson heading into 2025. Okay, how about our first rookie in the ranks? Tet Iora McMillan out of Arizona. He is wide receiver 1 on the PFF big board, wide receiver 17 in your early 2025 rankings. So what's got McMillan leading the way for year 1 wide receivers, Nate?
Yeah. So T-Mac is his nickname.
Yep,
Clear X
pretty good one.
receiver in the NFL, 6'5", going to be one of the taller wide receivers in the NFL. Very accomplished throughout his college career. Will have more receiving yards, receptions, touchdowns, all those things than most other wide receivers drafted in the first round over the past decade or so. So a lot of good things there in terms of his per play metrics. Not quite as good as some of the other wide receivers we've seen enter the NFL, but something that was interesting to note is compared to other of the taller wide receivers that we see, a little bit faster than some of these other wide receivers, more elusive, a higher avoided tackle rate. So I think the potential is there for him to be an excellent NFL receiver. For me, a lot of the concern is just where his potential landing spots could be. He's expected to be one of these top 10 NFL draft picks. And oftentimes, when you have a wide receiver picked in the top 10, it's on a team that does not have a great quarterback situation. So we could very well see that play out this season where, especially when you're talking about an X receiver, he has at least in college, had a more deep passes and a higher deep target rate than some of these other taller receivers. And the higher average depth of target you get, the more the quarterback matters. So some concerns around who he gets at quarterback, but we've seen other teams be able to overcome that recently. We saw Brian Thomas be able to have an excellent season despite poor quarterback play and being one of the taller wide receivers from that last draft class. So certainly something he can overcome. And I think my dream scenario is he gets picked number 4 by the Patriots. Going back to what I was saying with T. Higgins, it would be McMillan taking that role as the clear top outside receiver for New England with Drake May, who has a pretty decent intermediate and deep throw accuracy. So I think if he lands with the Patriots, that could be pretty excellent for his rookie season. But a little bit of concern if he lands in some of these other teams in the top 10.
Yeah, I was looking at our PFF mock drafts articles here on the website, and Trevor's most recent mock draft article has Tet McMillan going to the Las Vegas Raiders at 6, and then Mason Cameron wrote one up this week as well. He also has Tet McMillan going to the Raiders at 6, so it seems like he's inside that kind of range there. There's definitely obviously a need for the Raiders. They can continue to build that offense, but yeah, we don't know what the quarterback situation is going to be like there, and obviously they have the great Brock Bowers as well. So could be interesting if it's in Las Vegas as well.
Yeah, and like the Jets are after pick 7, and that's probably only if they don't have Aaron Rodgers, because then they also don't have Devontae Adams. Probably the Panthers potentially an option. The Saints at 9. All teams were like Bryce Young, even though he got better this year, not super excited about his deeper accuracy. And then the Saints either with Derek Carr or whatever they end up doing at quarterback.
Yeah, there's not a lot of great spots here inside the top 10, but there's some potential there. Obviously, we're going to bet on the talent a little bit here and hope that he can kind of deliver. But quarterback play is going to play a part in that. But if he gets a Malik Neighbors type target share, then it might not matter. So we'll see. All right, Tyreek Hill is up next. He has fallen a long way from his top 5 ADP ranks of the past few seasons after finishing no worse than wide receiver 6 from 2020 to 2023. But what have you done for me lately? Tyreek finished as wide receiver 18 and will be 31 years old come the start of the 2025 season. The signs of decline have to push him outside the top 12, I think, Nate, coming out of 2024 now. So is there hope that he could ever get back to that range for you?
I think there's still hope that maybe this year was just the odd year out, but I think there are some pretty clear signs that he isn't quite the same wide receiver he once was. He'll be turning 31 years old in the next month or two. So that is on the pretty old end for a wide receiver. And especially when you have a career built on your speed, it seems like these past few years, it's just been if you look at the tracking data, just not quite as many plays where he's getting those top speeds. So still among the top wide receivers in terms of how fast he is, just not that clear top wide receiver in terms of speed. So I think having that decline has played a role. I know there's been injuries, but there seems to be pretty consistent injuries these past 2 years. And at his age, would kind of expect those to continue as well. And the main concern that we had last year was what if Jalen Waddle kind of overtakes Hill as the top receiver? And I think we're getting to a point where that's even more likely to happen this year. Now that Waddle is 1 year closer to the age where you typically expect wide receivers to be at their peak, and Hill is 1 year away from that. So I was a little surprised to see some consensus early rankings have Hill a bit higher in terms of wide receivers, but I think even though there's the chance that he's still a top 5 fantasy wide receiver, I think any of these top 18 wide receivers we've talked about, they could make the top 5 this year, and it wouldn't be all that surprising. Where I think Hill has probably by far the highest odds of not finishing among the top 30 wide receivers this season compared to the other wide receivers we've talked about. I think almost everyone else, the main thing is, okay, yeah, there's an injury that can happen to anyone. And if that happens, then they fall significantly. But I think Hill, even if he doesn't have that like season ending injury, could play almost the entire year and just not be as big of a factor as we've seen in the past.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good point. Like, it was definitely, I think, surprising this season. Like, we always kind of knew that drop off was going to come at some point, but like after that 2023 season, he posted like the best receiving grade of his career, 93.8, best yards per route run for his career, 3.72. Like, it didn't necessarily feel like 2024 was going to be the year where there'd be like a big enough dip to take him out of that top 12, but it kind of clearly was, right? Like, he went from a career year in PFF grades and yards per route run to what ended up being career lows in PFF grades, like overall receiving grade, and yards per route run as well, 1.75 this past year. Now, yeah, he'll have a chance to bounce back better than like his career low numbers in 2025 or in 2024, I think, but probably not nearly as high as those career highs that we saw in 2023 is kind of the point, right? So that puts him in that top 15 to top 20 range, since he's definitely capable of being better than he was last year, even at 31. And based on kind of his own standards, those marks shouldn't be too high of a bar to clear either. So could end up being maybe a nice value as long as he doesn't kind of continue to decline. But I'm with you. I could see the same thing where he continues to decline and then falls outside of this top 20 range as well. So I think this is a good spot to kind of have him.
Yeah, there's also like right after the season, it sounded like he was requesting a trade.
Right.
Now it sounds like he wasn't requesting one.
Yeah.
But if there's a bad start to the season, then he's probably going to request one again. And we saw a number of wide receivers get traded this season, and none of them really do much for their teams, at least in terms of fantasy production over the rest of the year. So also kind of concerned that, yeah, maybe he gets traded unless he goes back to Kansas City like everyone else ends up back in Kansas City after a couple of years. But
yeah, that'd be crazy. All right, we said we'd do like a detailed 12 here. You also had one more name in this kind of fourth tier, Nate. Mike Evans, coming off his 11th straight season of 1,000 receiving yards. He's wide receiver 19 for you, and wraps up the top 4 tiers for you. So anything to add on Mike Evans for you?
Just another player who's been consistent, but slightly similar concerns with Hill of like he is right at that age where you see wide receivers no longer play in the NFL. So he's right at that end, and losing the offensive coordinator is probably going to hurt. With Jalen McMillan playing so well over the second half of the season, that could also impact things of Evans not seeing quite as many targets, but he's still graded very well as a receiver. So feel like Evans is a bit safer of a play, just not quite as high of an upside play as where Hill, there's a chance he rebounds and then he's back to being a top 5 wide receiver. Where Evans, we know he should be pretty good. We know we're probably safe starting him this upcoming year. He just probably doesn't have that top 10 range of possibilities as much as some of these other wide receivers.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fair. And I mean, as the Tampa Bay Buccaneers proved this year, getting him his 1,000 yards is very high on their priority list as well. So they should be feeding him the ball at a pretty high rate here. So that's going to do it for us this week. Thank you all for tuning in. That kind of wraps up our 2025 ranking series as well. We'll kind of turn our attention to other topics here in the weeks ahead, actually including some dynasty rankings next week. We'll do some IDP stuff. We'll cover some free agency and of course the NFL draft. So hopefully you'll tune in for all of that. Nate, thank you for putting this series together. All the article versions of your positional rankings and tiers are up on pff.com now as well. So what's coming down the pipe for you next week?
Next week it will be dynasty rankings. We'll also not long after have some updated rankings in general, just going through everything that happened throughout the playoffs, as well as just expanding the rankings since I only did 150 people and there's far more players I can rank. So we'll at least get to 200 in the next version of the rankings. Also know at least sometime in these next few weeks, we'll have a mock draft for the NFL, but one where you can only draft the skill players. So more of a fantasy football spin on what a mock draft can look like and try to do a nice job matching some of these players with what teams they could end up having a lot of success with.
Yeah, that's a fun one to look at as well. But yeah, other than that, I mean, I think I don't even remember what I wrote this week. I got free agency free agency primers for the offensive skill position. So basically, looking at each team's what kind of usage they're losing in free agency, or I guess potentially losing, seeing what their team needs are, and talking about potential fits and stuff like that. So did that for offense. Got an IDP version of it as well. Wrote up ideal landing spots and then the catchable target rate versus the created expected fantasy points. That I wrote that up last week as well. So yeah, that's it for us this week. Enjoy the Super Bowl, and until next time, peace out.